Welcome to Rise and Rouse, a podcast for people who give a damn. Please continue to share the podcast with your friends. We're seeing more and more people tuning in each week, and it gives me such joy. This is your host, Erin Allgood, social impact strategist, consultant, and trader to whiteness. This week on Rise and Rouse, you'll hear my conversation with Mazarine Treyz, a fellow nonprofit consultant and friend. She is an effectiveness coach who specializes in human design. For anyone unfamiliar, human design is a method of self-knowledge and reflection. Mazarine describes this work more in the episode. For the last 5 years, she's consulted for nonprofits and governments in the US and Canada, helping executives, leaders, and small teams operate more effectively by knowing their unique designs. We talk about what it means to move through the world in a more embodied way, how white supremacy culture shows up in the nonprofit sector, and how to shift away from those practices and norms. This is a full, candid, energetic conversation that is chock full of amazing resources so you can keep learning. Mazarine, thank you so much for being here with me today on the Rise and Rouse podcast. I am just so grateful to have you here. I am so excited for this conversation, and I love you so much, and obviously just so honored to have you as a guest too. So let me just give folks a little intro to who you are, and then I'm going to hand it over to you to expound a little bit on everything. Mazarine Treyz is an effectiveness coach who specializes in human design. She helps leaders with teams become more effective through human design and the gene keys. For the last 5 years, she's consulted for nonprofits and governments in the US and Canada, helping executives, leaders, and small teams operate more effectively by knowing their unique designs. And I'm just going to pause there. I know you've got more to the bio, but I'm going to hand it over to you to just share a little bit more about who you are. But we originally met through an organization called Nonprofitist for nonprofit consultants. And that has been, it was just such a rich and wonderful and fortuitous, serendipitous meeting of the both of us. But I will pause there because I can keep going and let you actually talk.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks. So yeah, for the last 13 years, I've been doing my business, and it's been about fundraising consulting and leadership consulting for the nonprofit sector. And I love doing it. And in recent years, I've realized that human design and the gene keys actually really do help us in personality typing ways, allow us to understand how we can truly be of greatest service to the world. And I really find that work so fulfilling. So if people want to learn more about that, then go to humandesignreadings.net, check it out, get your mybodygraph.com, go see your design, and be like, cool, I want to learn more, and then we can hang out and talk about that. So
I'm so excited about that. I love the way that you bring all of the different pieces together in this, you make connections in ways that I blows my mind, honestly. Whenever we have a conversation, I'm like, oh, I just love how our conversations spiderweb, and I get to understand the connections between human design and how do we create a more equitable, beautiful world that we want to step into, and all those and everything in between. So just so fantastic. So tell me some of the cool shit you're working on right now. I'd love to just hear what's alive in your world.
Yeah, since 2020, lots of things have changed. And I think our sector in that time has really started to undergo a crisis of ethics around what we're based on, which is white supremacy, and acknowledging that and coming to terms with that. And then what comes next? How do we do better as a sector and do better for our world? So with the George Floyd protests and with, the climate crisis and with all these things that are pretty depressing and scary, I love that so many of us are rising to the occasion and saying, okay, what do I do now? And so to that end, what's really alive for me right now is I'm working on my conference, which is going to be over by the time this airs, but it's called A Path to Action. And it's basically with the people who wrote Collecting Courage book. Everyone should check it out, collectingcourage.org. There is a playlist as well as a book. And it's all about Black, Canadian, and American fundraisers talking about their experience in the nonprofit sector. And they said, people love this book, but what's next? Oh, you took one DEI workshop, you wanted to have a path to action. This is our workbook, A Path to Action. So it's coming out this month. We're doing a conference around it, and then I'm collaborating with them. So what's really alive for me is to not be a leader, but to be a collaborator. And I feel like that's one of the ways that I want to deprogram myself as I do this other deprogramming work for people. So it's inner work, outer work at the same time.
I love that so much. I know I looked at the lineup for the conference and it's fantastic. And it's going to be just such a great resource for folks, which we'll make sure it gets into the show notes. So let's talk a little bit too, just about this idea of like how our personal and individual work starts to connect to collective liberation, because these are things that I've heard, you and I have both talked about quite a bit. And I'm so excited to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, I am not an expert at all in collective liberation. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know what I'm doing. I majored in poetry and gender studies in school, and that was 20 years ago. So when it comes to I don't know how to answer your question. We will have a session at the conference with Denisha Thompson that's going to be talking about walking the path to collective liberation. We'll have another session with Rachel Wiley talking about sort of the creativity inherent in equity work, because we've never lived in a world with true equity. So we're going to have to be artists to like imagine that world together. So like, I think people should probably read like bell hooks and stuff.
I think where I wanted to like what I was really interested in when I was starting to formulate that question was just this idea of, you know, we talked about betraying whiteness and like how betraying whiteness, I think, connects to just creating a better world, you know, in so many different ways. And like, how do we do that individually? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. So for people that are feeling activated by that language, stay with us. Stay with us right now. So you can't see me, but I identify as like a white person with a French German extraction, whatever. For me, like, I talked with my friend Anika about being a traitor to whiteness, and she's like, you need to make that the panel at the conference. And I was like, yes. So we're going to have that at the conference too. But we're going to have different folks talk about it. For me, it really means questioning what white supremacy has taught us is normal for us to do. And there's a whole list of like white supremacy behaviors that you'll probably see every day at your nonprofit or in your business or wherever you are in government. And, you know, they're laid out in Tima and Okun's dismantlingracism.org list. So everything from individualism to urgency to either or thinking, black and white thinking. There's so many of them. There's a lot of fear that goes with it as well. And only one right way to do things, worship of the written word. And so for the last couple of years, I've been chatting with people about like, okay, so there's ways you can do things differently on a structural level, in a, you know, day-to-day level, and then kind of like just interrupting oppression when you see it. So, the way you do things is just as important as what you're doing. And so earlier this year, I organized a conference that had very much a lot of like urgency, and I had collaborators that I was like, okay, right, like there's a lot of urgency here, there's a lot of fear here. I don't like how this feels, right? And with this current conference I'm doing, it feels more like, oh, we're just being more chill with this. We're not having urgency culture. We're not doing individualistic stuff. We're just being really, really like open and hopefully more emotionally aware. And that for me is being a traitor to whiteness. It's saying I don't have to be in charge as a white person. It's saying I don't have all the answers. It's saying a lot of the fears that I have were implanted in me through white supremacy, through my own family, just teaching me what they knew. So like if you've ever been afraid of getting too fat or afraid of being poor, what you may not realize is that, you know, there's this little gremlin in the back of your mind, which is implanted by white supremacy. It's like, if you read the book, oh God, but what's their name? I can't remember it now. It's going to come to me in a second. But it's called, Belly of the Beast. And in that book, Deshaun Harrison talks about how, I have a blog post about this, we can link it. A lot of what white people are afraid of is becoming a poor black woman, basically. And so a lot of the fears, you know, you can see that directly relate to that, you know. So when we get defensive or when we get, you know, worried, right, about becoming that, we're taking on a mask that we can also take off. I want people to understand that when it comes to becoming a traitor to whiteness, just because you have white skin, that means nothing, right? You could have brown skin and be like deeply embedded in whiteness. So there is a podcast I did with Dr. Deborah Jenkins, who is the former head of the sociology department at Clark College. And so she talked about like the 6 steps of like racial awareness at the end of that interview, which I highly recommend people look at because it kind of helps, I would say, Black and brown people sort of like deprogram from whiteness as well. So we can link that in the show notes too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that that's, for just personally, I think we're all on this journey too of that, being a traitor to whiteness, undoing kind of like the ways in which or just starting to like become more aware of this culture that we like inhabit and live in and swim in, and how many of our behaviors are linked directly to that. So it's like it takes a lot to actually start to go through that process of letting go of, or it's not even letting go, but like understanding our identities as white folks. You know what I mean? Taking the mask off. Yeah, exactly. And so one that I'll just pick up on, just as you were talking about it, that I will say myself is particularly challenging is that urgency part of things. Oh my goodness, that has been one of the hardest things for me to break down, because it's just especially as a consultant, as somebody who's working with clients all the time, as somebody who, I mean, you and I are both probably, I would say, like highly productive people too. And so and for me, like urgency, productivity, kind of like getting things done, I will always try to like get more, like try to cram more into a day, and that leads to the urgency that leads to that. So that intentional slowing down of things is where I have started to understand and see and to undo a lot of that conditioning that I've had. So I don't know, go ahead.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's time for this. It's past time for this, right? Like, and we've seen this in our nonprofits, like, oh yeah, you had urgency about this issue, like for the last 10 years and it's still here. Maybe breaking down your body isn't serving you. Maybe like, trying to make people work like robots isn't serving you. And so what's behind that is white supremacy, slavery, right? So there's 2 books that I would recommend to your listeners. One's called Laziness Does Not Exist by Dr. Devin Price, and I have a blog post about resisting work. There's another one called Resisting Work by Peter Fleming, which is great. And there's another one by Sarah Jaffe called Work Won't Love You Back. So there's so many good books that have come out recently about how this urgency culture makes us treat ourselves like robots and how it is going to break us down, even if we can be productive in the system. Like Devin Price was super productive in the system, and then his body broke down. To go back to your sense of urgency piece, there is a podcast called the Emergent Strategy Podcast with Dr. Adrienne Marie Brown. Maybe she's not a doctor. I forget. Anyway, the point is they have several episodes called Slow Down Your Slowdown. And I really encourage people to listen to those episodes because when we allow ourselves to just have that space to breathe, it changes so much. It changes how you interact with other people, and it helps you not unthinkingly replicate these systems of oppression that we just don't know anything else. And so I want to just tell people who are listening, depersonalize you falling into this trap. It's all around you. It's not a surprise you fell in this trap. It's not even personal when you do it. It's completely acting out a system that you have no control over. But now that you're becoming more aware of your behavior, you can change how you respond to it.
That's the biggest thing is I think people think that they have to do things perfectly. You know what I mean? They get this awareness and then all of a sudden they have to do things perfectly. And that's, I think, comes with any kind of when you're starting to, step into and understand racial justice.
Perfectionism is another aspect of white supremacy. So I was in 2020, I was like, what do I do? I feel so frozen and stuck, and I don't want to fuck up, but I want to address this George Floyd protest. I want to address the Breonna Taylor murder. And like my friend Jana was like, just do it, Mazarine. Don't wait for perfection. Like, I screw up all the time. And I was like, oh, okay. So I'm still learning all of this, and you're not going to get it right the first or even the 10th time you do it. But the point is that you're moving in a direction. And I'm asking my collaborators as well, like, if I fuck up, just tell me. Like, I don't want to like have you sit here and think, oh, I can't tell her that she's like fucking up right now, and and replicating urgency culture in this meeting,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right. And having those kinds of trusting relationships with people too. And even if it's not trusted, like just trusting that it is okay to fuck up, on from time to time. One of the other guests on this in this season is Audrey Holst, who is a perfectionism coach. I think she works with perfectionists and like really helps them she helps them from a understanding the neurological kind of ways in which and the physical ways in which perfectionism shows up in our body, and how do we start to counteract that through embodiment, which I think is one of those things that's just, as we're kind of talking about this too, like that idea of like starting to become more embodied is another key to doing this kind of work in the world, right? Like, and that goes along with like slowing down and like and being able to be in tune with your body versus kind of staying so busy, staying in that urgency and in that kind of like rinse repeat kind of cycle. And that's like, for me, that's like one of the hardest also things to do too. Like embodiment for me, it looks like painting. It looks like going for a walk, being in the woods. It means meditating. There's, so many different ways, and dancing and things like that. There's that it shows up, but it's also, I think we're all, I mean, I even did this yesterday where I spent a whole bunch of time just sitting there being like, I can't pick up my paintbrush because I have to do XYZ before I do that. And then I woke up this morning with like a pain in my back and a pain in my, like it's the physical, like the delaying of that kind of moving and like the delaying of the signals that my body, like addressing those signals that my body was creating was like, it's showing up then, of course, like as pain in my body. So in what ways are you are you able to, one, just kind of like are counteracting that whiteness in your world? Two, like how do you move through the world in an embodied way? Because you're probably one of those people I think of the most when I think of somebody who is like truly embodying themselves in this world.
That's so kind of you. I'm going to take that in and say thank you for seeing me. So when I do these conferences, we create embodiment rituals in the beginning of the day. In this conference, we're going to have a sound bath, a live harp sound bath in the beginning of the day. We're going to have one of our speakers sing a Nina Simone song. We're going to give people a chance to pause and reconnect with their bodies, because talking about being a traitor to whiteness can bring up some shit for people. And, it can be activating. And so as I'm getting older, I'm learning like, hey, if you help people's bodies feel safe, they're going to be a lot more interested in staying with you instead of disassociating or checking out. And especially online, where everyone is so sick of being now for like 2.5 years. It's even more important to have embodiment practices. So I try to get outside every day. I try to go to the gym with my mask on, of course. I try to fully express myself in lovemaking, which is very, very fun. I also have fun by myself. But more than that, I love to just do a little dance around the kitchen when I'm cooking and, sing. I love singing. It really stimulates the vagus nerve. It makes you feel like more calm. Your breathing changes. I meditate, sometimes. But I also want to remind people that if something starts to feel like a chore, you don't have to keep doing it. You don't have to treat yourself like a robot. Yeah, I like to bike, but I don't do that as much as I used to. So just breathing together. Could we just take a pause for a second and just take a deep breath in together and a deep breath out? Because I think this is like the perfect moment to do it. What do you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm going to lift up my arms because it helps me. So I'm going to lift up my arms and breathe in deep. I'm going to breathe out. Maybe one more time. Deep breath in. And out. Thank you for letting me have the space and time with you to do that. I feel like I have a tendency to data dump in interviews, and I want people to just be like, wow, that's a lot of information. Okay, you need to disconnect right now. I get that. But if you can just pause the podcast, take a deep breath, come back with us, we're still going to talk about some cool shit. So.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's, it is so hard to, well, I mean, it's certainly, as you're saying, a data dump, for sure. But like, I also want to name how important it is that you talk about the lineage of the thinking, because let's talk about like how concepts can get co-opted by people in so many ways and not actually go back to like talking about where that thought originated. You know what I mean? And in so many ways it can get that thinking that oftentimes is originating from Black feminist authors. You know what I mean? Gets whitewashed in some way or repurposed. I've seen it used so many times for like capitalistic purposes. And I'm like, no. Like, no, that's not what that's for. This is not for you to like try to be like, oh, here's like this strong Black woman. I'm going to take her words and then go try to sell something. Like, are you fucking kidding me? I think you've seen that before too.
And that's a fear. I mean, that's a fear when I do these conferences. I'm like, I don't want to just like pay people a pittance and keep most of the money. So we're splitting the money equally in this conference, which makes me feel really good. But also, I mean, if people want to go back even further, check out Bell Hooks' The Will to Change book, because she talks about dominance culture. And dominance culture is something that nonprofits absolutely take part in. I mean, have you ever really stopped to think about how our workplaces are generally oligarchies? Like, let's talk about power. And Bell Hooks is very, very good at this. And she's like, look, way before the girl boss came along, right? She's like, what if we don't have to aspire to dominance? And what does it look like if we live in a world where that's not the norm? So that's something I'd ask you to question. Like, why is it that you don't have control over where, when, and how you work necessarily? Or why is it that the board has all of the power and none of the responsibility, and the staff have none of the power and all of the responsibility? And how could we disconnect from dominance culture and have different modes of structure and organizations that are more equitably distributing power? Like Shivanti Daniel said at my conference in March, she's from Institute.coop, check that shit out. How do we have more democratic workplace structures for like co-ops and nonprofits? And then also I had Sean Good speak and Daniel Perez speak on, he's part of the Nonprofit Employees Union, and that's getting huge grounds in the US right now. So yeah, so there's ways to there's people that are already doing this work, so don't feel like you have to recreate the wheel. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I had a conversation with a board last week about how, just talking about like how the organization is maturing, in a way, and the board is used to kind of being more hands-on in things, and they're kind of transitioning the board to more of a governance structure, more of a governing board, and less hands-on. And one of the things I had pointed out to folks was that because of course they have an equity statement, a lot of organizations have equity statements that are literally there just on paper. Some organizations really live into it for sure too at the same time. And there's everyone in between. But this in particular, I was trying to make this explicitly, that in order to really fully embody an equity statement as an organization, that the board had to be comfortable sharing power with the staff and starting to understand how to shift the power to the staff. And oh boy, that did not go well. Very, very angry at me for saying that. And it was just a few board members. I don't know. I didn't get a pulse on all of the board members, but basically, we're in a strategic planning process. They wanted to start back we're at the point where I'm starting to write the plan, and they wanted to go back to square one and literally relitigate everything that had already been done by a strategic planning committee.
Yeah. I mean, hearing that story, it sounds like people got activated in their bodies, and going back to embodiment, if you were in the room with them, even in Zoom, be like, what's happening inside you right now? And most likely defensiveness comes from, they're not understanding how they're replicating systems of oppression or taking it personally that you said we're replicating systems of oppression. And that's hard. That's hard to get past. I hear your frustration in that.
And it's hard sometimes too to like just pause folks and to be like, hey, I need you to like, think about why you're getting defensive, and it's, I'm a good facilitator. You're an amazing facilitator. Like, it's hard in those moments still to kind of to come up against it and to then be able to figure out how you move forward in a way that then doesn't derail a conversation. Even though I'm practiced at it, it's hard. It's so hard still.
Well, you don't have to hold yourself to perfectionist standards either. And next year, I'm actually going to try even harder to not activate people by having different names for my conferences and call it nonprofit futures instead of the party at the end of the patriarchy, and just make it a little bit more innocuous sounding to get people to come. To your point, you have people in that room that maybe are not at the same point on this path as you are. And it's okay if you don't reach everybody because you're planting seeds.
Yep. I love that. I love planting seeds. And I can see in almost every single, organization I work with, I do that too. I mean, how about you? Where are you planting seeds? Where have you seen those seeds planted and maybe then been able to look back and be like, ooh, I planted that seed. Look at that tree that's growing out of that now.
It's really hard because I'm not tied to any one organization. So I get to do these speaking gigs and I get to do these conferences. And then unless people tell me afterwards, this is what happened to me, I never know. I never know really what comes of it. I'll say that it feels like over the last 13 years as I've been doing this work and learning and growing myself, that my ability to hold space has shifted. My ability to slow down, my slowdown has shifted. I'm becoming more aware of these systems of oppression myself, and therefore I can teach people about it. And, I got paid to do a keynote last year on post-capitalist futures, which I don't think would have happened 13 years ago. So I see this in, I'm hopefully not co-opting movement language, hopefully, but I see this in how we're spending our money. And you said it yourself, sometimes equity statements are just statements, but some people want to do more. And to that, I say, look at your budget. Where are you allocating money for continuing education, mentorship, reparations? And that includes the land that you're on and the native people that own that land. And are you paying them rent?
Mm-hmm.
Some people are, so I was talking with a guy who was working at Bard College and he was admissions coordinator. And he's like, I'm going to go out to these tribes in Midwest and we're going to get some people to come to Bard. And I said, have you gotten into right relationship with the tribal land that you're currently on? And he said, oh no, that's a big problem. Actually, we haven't done that.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I would be surprised if these other tribes would listen to you then.
Right.
Maybe your school with a $1 billion endowment could spare some money to the tribes that actually own this land.
Yep.
That caretake this land. So I think a budget is a value statement, and I encourage everyone listening to look at your budget and say, hey, we say we believe this stuff. Let's see if we can do a little better next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm helping organizations right now in our strategic planning processes to where do we let's put our money where our mouth is for sure. Let's actually live these values through the budget. And it's it looks different for every organization for sure. Certainly where they are kind of on this continuum of kind of understanding the social justice and where they actually fit into that and what's their lane and all of that. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things if organizations don't know how to do it, there are people like me who can help, but and people like you who can help them kind of really understand some of these things too. But yeah, it can't be overlooked that we don't do an equity statement can't be a standalone thing for an organization. It actually has to you have to really make sure that equity, those principles actually permeate every single aspect of the organization, both internally and externally in the work that they do.
And right. And if you do the internal work, right? Internal work inside yourself, then you're going to feel a lot less defensive about the need for this work. And that's why we made the Path to Action conference, because it's helping you do the inner work and the outer work at the same time. And it never ends. I mean, that's another thing we're going to talk about in our panel about being a traitor to whiteness. This work never ends. There's always more layers to unpeel. And as long as you're not stuck in perfectionism, which is another aspect of white supremacy, you're going to be fine. I mean, let's face it, you and I are not responsible for colonialism, but we do benefit from it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so acknowledging that doesn't have to make us bad guys.
Right. Acknowledging it, and then using the knowledge that we have and the privilege that we have to be not just allies, but accomplices too. That's one of the things I think you were probably originally the person who had said that to me. And I was like, oh yeah, damn, that's right. It's not that I'm just going to go, like, allyship can be so performative. Being an accomplice is like, yep, I'm right here alongside you, like causing trouble. You know what I mean? Causing good trouble.
Well, thanks for having me on your podcast. I hope that we're moving the Overton window a little further to the left for everybody who's listening, and you can look up what the Overton window is.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, we can link to that too. One more thing that I want to like just touch on before I guess we wrap, like, is just, you know, so one of the things we've talked about before is this idea of like despair is a luxury we can't afford right now. So kind of thinking back to, you know, what you were saying earlier around like 2020 and how your work has shifted so much over those last couple of years. And right now it's very, you know, we're still living with COVID. We're still living, I mean, we never stopped living through this kind of racial reckoning, but the recession that we have, like we're getting hit on all fronts. How are you finding hope amidst all of the bullshit that's being thrown at us right now?
I look to the leadership of Trisha Hersey and the Nat Ministry. And if people want to look up the Nat Ministry on Instagram or get her book, Rest is Resistance, she had some wonderful tweets several years ago that I would love to put in the show notes as well, because they are so powerful. But she rested and she took naps every day when she was very, very poor. And she said, this culture cannot have me. This culture cannot make me crazy over its constant performing, you know, urgency and despair. I encourage people to disconnect from the things that make you feel urgency and despair. At least once a day, turning off your phone or stepping with your computer and just going on a walk. If that is available to you, or painting, as you said, Erin, which we share that passion, love to paint with absolutely no purpose. So, we have learned through, you know, various exposés that the Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Instagram algorithms, the more, and also other websites, right? The more disturbing news that we read, the longer we're going to stay on the website. And so they have an impetus to tell us about every little terrible thing that happens. And so knowing that, now that you know that you're being manipulated, I encourage you to check out reasonstobecheerful.world, which is run by David Byrne. And it helps you see there's a lot of good stuff going on in the world too. Maybe your nonprofit could be featured there for all the good work that you're doing. It's something to think about if you're a fundraiser or a PR person for a nonprofit, or a leader, right? But the ways that I find hope are that we have a groundswell of momentum that is undeniable. Like, we thought this was going to be a red wave in this last election, and it turned into a blue one. Not for everyone, but we got new members of the squad. For us in Oregon, we got the first openly lesbian governor. We have, like, you know, as a queer person, that's like so fun for me to like see that representation and know that that's happening. But that's not going to solve all our problems. You know, that's just a little tiny piece of it. So I'd say that we've got a long way to go, and movements take 10 years. And when we're feeling activated with the trauma of COVID in the last 2.5 years, let alone all the other grief we need to feel about how this country treats people of color, the carceral state. Like, there's so many things. We had open fascism on the streets here. Like, I was afraid to go out. Like, and then we have all these smoke from all these fires. Like, we couldn't go outside for weeks. Like, every summer now, that's the norm. So I say that to say bad shit is always going to be happening. I turn towards art. I turn directly towards the things that feed me. Even if I can't go outside, even if there's a lot of things to be sad about, because I will think of Trisha Hershey again. This culture cannot have me. They want to take away my joy, and they can't. And that's actually one of the chapters in the Collecting Courage book. It's joy. And it's so beautiful. And I actually have a quote from Anika Allen about joy and love. So Nelson Mandela said, "May your choices reflect your hopes, not your fears." And Nina Simone said, "You've got to learn to leave the table when love's no longer being served." And, there's so much we could say about love. There's so much I want to say about love. But I encourage everyone who's listening to get the Collecting Courage book. It's on Amazon. I know don't support Amazon, but if you have to, do it with this book. It's so, so good. And I think it'll be a real eye-opener for people with white skin who haven't necessarily had a lot of relationships with people of color in their lives over the years, that, wow, this is how our sector could do better. And it's not about pointing a finger. This book, I read it in one sitting. It made me cry. It made me laugh. It gave me goosebumps. Like, it's a great book. It has poetry, has a soundtrack. It's a good book.
I've been listening to the soundtrack, and I love it so very, very much.
You'll find new people to love on there, new artists.
I love that. I love that kind of the way in which, especially like music for me, is that I kind of go down the rabbit hole and it becomes this kind of evolution. Like, and you kind of been like, oh, I love that person. Oh, okay. And I think of it as being such a collective experience. Literally sharing playlists. I love the ripple effects that happen when that happens.
Let's link that playlist in the show notes then.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Mazarine, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else like that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
So this book called Virtue Hoarders by Catherine Liu is something I'd encourage any nonprofit person or board member, however you identify, listening to read. And the reason I say this, she was on the Upstream podcast. I mean, a lot of what I'm saying comes from the podcast that I listen to. And I'm trying to like name check all of them, but I'm not going to get all of them. The reason that I recommend the book Virtue Hoarders, the subtitle is The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class. I've written a blog post about this, but also you should just buy its book. It's very tiny. Right now, we have like the discipline of hope, which is really important, but also we need to be looking at how do I make my habits into virtues that maybe I don't need to be so obsessed with proving that I'm better than other people. And if you start doing that, some of this equity work will be a lot easier for you, because then it's okay for you to make mistakes. There's less perfectionism. That's just one of the many things that this book has taught me. And you can also check out my blog post about it. But there's a lot of things in here about how we're brainwashed by Puritanism, and so much more. I mean, there's so many good pieces. I'll just say that, sometimes when we enter the nonprofit sector, we think, oh, well, everything I do is good. And actually, we may be just perpetuating these systems of oppression and not even realizing it. And this book will help us start to understand how we might do that.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I will say, like, one of the ways in which I have seen that show up, because I had started my career doing food systems consulting work and have now shifted to doing just broader social change work. But for so many food organizations, that is like a big, big question for them. I don't know if it's a big question for them, but it's one of the things that when they start to go down that rabbit hole of like, oh yeah, we help people access healthy food. Okay, well, what does healthy food mean? And that becomes a huge rabbit hole to go down, to be like, okay, but like cake is healthy, you know what I mean? Because it fills your soul up. Like, we can't sit here and say like, what is what is nourishing versus not nourishing, because it is so, it depends on culture. It depends on people's, just their background, their upbringing, what they actually can even access in that moment, their dietary, restrictions. You can't make a blanket statement about what healthy is, especially when it comes to food and things like that. And I see a lot of organizations kind of make that, start to grapple with that when they're like, oh, wait, we don't want to be virtue hoarders, but we also need to create parameters around what is it that we actually do? What do we give to people? What are we, what is the mission, the lane that they're in, and how do they start to define those things? And so I love that you share that, because it's obviously the Virtue Hoarders, the book is just such a great resource. It's also just such an important concept for us all to kind of think about, where and which are we trying to hoard that ourselves? Where are the organizations that we work with for trying to hoard that? And how do we start to disrupt that as another means of starting to disrupt that white supremacy culture that we all swim, breathe, live in? Yeah, exactly.
I love that you brought it back to the structural analysis, because again, this is not saying, oh, you're a nonprofit leader and you're doing it wrong. No, we're not trying to shame anyone here. Shame is not useful. Instead, what we're trying to do is say, hey, you have this mask on that, and it's come from white supremacy, that because by virtue of being a white person, you know everything, or you should know everything. It's not okay for you to make mistakes, and you have to be in charge. So I hope that people who read this book and who read dismantlingracism.org can start to say to themselves, how can I step back from power hoarding? How can I have less power? And how can I share power in a way that, like you were trying to do in your strategic planning meeting, respects the dignity of everyone here? And there's blueprints for this. You don't have to do this alone. Again, the individualism inherent in white supremacy. You can ask the people around you, and you can also look to co-ops and how they're run. There's so many other ways you can crack this nut. Just because we've always done it this oligarchic way does not mean that you have to keep running yourself ragged as an executive director, trying to control everything.
Control is such bullshit anyway.
It's dominance culture. It's not totally even personal. It's dominance culture.
Mm-hmm. It totally is. And I find whenever in my own personal life, when I start to control things, when I'm starting to get stressed, I try to control things more. It's all about trying to fix or assuage my anxiety around things. And it's just fuck, I fell down that rabbit hole again. No. But right, it's but the awareness. Fear. Yeah.
That's the fear in white supremacy, right? We're so in it, we don't even realize that we're in fear.
Right.
So finding self-soothing techniques for yourself is imperative in the coming time. For me, I just use a tapping point for EFT. I just tap my collarbone, and it really, really grounds me and soothes me. But for you, maybe it's feeling your feet on the ground, or taking a walk, or going to acupuncture, or whatever it is,
Yeah. We've come so full circle, because now we're okay, well, here's how we embody, and how do we live in our body and use that as a means of grounding ourselves. And my goodness, yes. I could talk to you forever. That's pretty much how I feel about things.
I would tell people, watch this space. Next year's conferences are going to be epic. You want to be there. Go to MazarineTreyz.com, sign up for my newsletter. I will let you know multiple times about what's going on. We are still figuring out the lineup, but we are going to be a model of collaborative leadership. And if you want to see how to do the work, come.
And I'll also say that all of Mazarine's emails, or a lot of them, come with really funny memes and things like that, and cartoons. So it's worth it to get on her newsletter. I mean, obviously to know about all these amazing conferences that are coming up, but also just to be able to get those super fun, sometimes snarky, sometimes whatever, but they're always insightful and always give me a chuckle. I love that you share those things. So,
oh yeah, I have so many. I will hook you up.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for being here. I am just so grateful to you. I love you so much. And I'm just so excited to be able to put this in the world. And I am so honored that you joined me today. And, as I was getting this whole podcast thing started, you were like, yes, absolutely, I will be there. And that made me feel so good. And I'm so having your vote of confidence in the work that I do means the world to me. Thank you to Mazarine Treyz for joining me in conversation today. If you want to learn more about her work, you can check out mazarinetreyz.com, connect with her on LinkedIn, or follow her on Twitter. She's also offering a 15-minute free human design reading to all of our listeners so that you can learn about your design and find the gift in your shadow. Check the show notes for links. If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a 5-star rating and review to help us reach more people. Make sure to follow Rise and Rouse wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss your chance to hear from someone who gives a damn. Follow us on Instagram at Rise and Rouse and sign up for my newsletter by going to allgoodstrategies.com. Rise and Rouse is created and hosted by me, Erin Allgood. Is produced and edited by Steph George of Stefania Audio. Production support from Cleary-Morin and Jana Krizanova. Our theme music is written and produced by Chris Marion.